Andrew said that we'd take a bit of a change, of course, from the last session, and it will be a big change. I was, to put it bluntly, dropped in it. The invitation, I think, came to the Chief's office and then eventually it stopped with me. I'm going to read, because it took me a little while to get my head around what it is that we're talking about today, and I'm going to look perhaps more in the other direction in regard to building security capacity in other nations. I'll touch on Afghanistan, but I also want to look at some of the other things that we do, certainly the Air Force is involved in, that I believe actually is also about building partner nation security capacity. The challenge of an air perspective is an apt title for my presentation, because my response to the task of speaking on the subject was to ponder indeed what roles the RAF play in the delivery of Indigenous security capability development. My initial reaction to the thought of presenting on the subject was to look for parallels, naturally, with the Australian Army. Their efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan tend to define, and I've seen that in the couple of presentations today, tend to define what we understand by train, advise and assist. Elsewhere, the work of the Royal Australian Navy with Pacific nations under the Pacific Maritime Security Program also comes immediately to mind. But when it comes to understanding how the Royal Australian Air Force contributes, and perhaps more importantly can contribute in the future, we need to think a little more laterally. When it comes to planning an effective program of support for a partner nation contemplating the use of air power in a security role, understanding the political and financial constraints is key. As a C-130 pilot, I've spent a lot of time transporting troops and material in and out of theatres that require our assistance. However, I have spent little time on the ground training, advising or assisting those whom our work helps. And I'm certain that I would have spent less time forming the necessary personal relationships as much as my Army colleagues have done. Nevertheless, there are examples of the Air Force conducting Indigenous security capability development activities, and I'll mention a few of those over the next 15 minutes or so. I'll also mention some of the issues that work against the development of aviation security capability for those partner nations. Contemplating what can be done in the development of Indigenous security capability is made easier when we examine the reasons for such missions in the first instance. An obvious starting point is to examine the recently released Defence White Paper. Now, you've probably heard these over the last 2 days, but I'll go over them one more time. The paper lists 4 objectives of the Defence International Engagement, and they are to enhance ADF capability, to generate and sustain Australia's regional and global influence, generate active and effective security partnerships, and number 4, enhance international security resilience. The conduct of missions such as Build Partner Capacity Mission in Iraq is a clear example of the type of mission meeting those international engagement objectives just mentioned. Arguably, all 4 objectives are satisfied by the Iraq mission. But if I narrow the objectives to number 4, enhancing international security resilience, then I think we essentially have the topic of this conference. It is interesting then to look at this particular objective and understand the reasons for its inclusion and the implied scope. Throughout the White Paper we can find clear commitments to a rules-based global order and regional security and stability. Pursuit of these outcomes implies investing not only in military capability, but the whole spectrum of security-related capabilities. That spectrum includes such things as constabulary operations like anti-smuggling, countering illegal immigration, illegal fishing, but also anti-piracy. So what then can aviation offer a state in the pursuit of its developing security? The answer derives from the fundamental characteristics of air power, in particular, perspective, speed, reach and flexibility. An air power capability permits a swiftness of response and access to hard-to-reach areas. Air can provide vastly expanded horizons for superior views, increased patrol rates, increased payload, and where necessary, precision. In the higher end of the security spectrum, such as the build partner capacity in Iraq and Afghanistan, the use of air for the movement of troops, vehicles and equipment and stores is a key plank of their security development. These nations also have great need for the development of intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance. For both the mobility and the ISR role, the USAF is providing significant train, advise and assist support. But at the lower end of the security spectrum, we have policing of land borders and sea boundaries, on the lookout for smugglers, illegal immigrants and illegal fishermen. These types of mission are very important to nations, often of lesser means, many of which are to be found in the South Pacific and Southeast Asia. It is here where you can find many examples of the Royal Australian Air Force providing assistance to nations developing their security capability. Returning to my initial pondering about Air Force efforts in the Train Advise Assist mission, in light of those efforts that are conducted by the Australian Army, my first impressions were that Air Force contributed in the support of other agencies, especially Army, but that a review of Air Force contributions to activities in Iraq and Afghanistan would show little that could be considered an equivalent of the build partner capacity. So what then are the contemporary examples of Air Force participating in train, advise and assist missions? And specifically I mean working directly with partner nations in the development of their own security capability, as opposed to providing the logistical support to such missions through the provision of air transport or the conduct of military strike activities as we are currently conducting in Iraq and Syria now. At one end of the scale, Air Force has a number of personnel placements in key RAF organisations which provide professional development of partner nation military personnel. Some of these positions are relatively mundane and include office positions such as in Log Branch in Air Force Headquarters. In the training sphere, Air Force has a considerable international engagement effort. For example, RAF provides individual training on a number of courses including aircrew, air traffic, aeromedical evacuation, aviation safety officer, aviation medical officer, aircraft maintainer, armaments engineer, and the list goes on. Air Force is also involved in helping partner nations like Indonesia and Brunei improve their technical and operational safety and airworthiness regulations and cultures. Not quite as exciting as a joint flying activity, I admit, but vital in supporting the ongoing viability of those nations' aviation capabilities. RAF also assists security development through collective training exercises, sometimes in partnership with other nations such as the US. Examples include Exercise-Specific Air Rally, which is essentially a humanitarian and disaster relief activity, Pitch Black, which encompasses traditional military air roles such as offensive and defensive counter-air, but also HADR and search and rescue type missions. In the bilateral sphere, our efforts are also noteworthy. With the Indonesian Air Force, we conduct a range of annual exercises: Rajawali Oz-Indo, Oz-Indo Corpad, Albatross Oz-Indo, and Elang Oz-Indo. And those exercises are generally squadron to squadron, fighter types, maritime patrol and airlift activities. Then there's the Bersama series of activities with Malaysia. There's multiple exercises with Thailand, and the list goes on. Now, in those exercises, we're looking after our own training needs as well as looking to work with partner nations to develop interoperability, but also to improve their own security capabilities. Moving from training activities to operations, though, there are several efforts of note with clear aims to build partner nation security. Operation Solania is a Southwest Pacific fisheries and maritime security operation that provides a patrol capability on behalf of regional nations. It supports the protection of fisheries and other resources, and it also provides the opportunity for nations of lesser means to build security frameworks and to enable them to police their own borders. And Australia's long-term commitment to the South China Sea and Indian Ocean has been clear through the Air Force conduct of Op Gateway, based out of RMAF Butterworth in Malaysia. These maritime security patrols include Royal Malaysian Air Force Air Riders, and the mission provides both Australia and Malaysia with great situational awareness in an important region of growing significance. But it is also a key enabler for Malaysia to build its own maritime security apparatus. Of note, the gateway operations are enabled through the long-term commitment in the basing we have at the invitation of the Government of Malaysia. Meanwhile, our efforts in the Middle East are facilitated through a similar arrangement in that region. There are also lesser-known contributions in the South Pacific, including the RAF contribution to the joint operation called Pacific Angel. Also known as Pacific Partnership, in 2015, 13 RAF engineers and medical staff worked with other ADF members and the US Navy on board USNS Mercy and Millinocket and provided direct medical and engineering assistance to some of the Pacific's poorer and less capable populations. Considering all of these international engagement efforts, the personnel exchanges, the placements, Australia-based training, exercises and maritime patrolling in the Indo-Pacific Ocean, and the overseas force posture, I think it's fair to say that Air Force does provide an important and worthy contribution to the development of Indigenous security capability. However, I also believe that we could provide more at the higher end of the warfighting spectrum if asked to do so. To examine this further, I'll outline a mission undertaken by the US in Afghanistan as a good example of what could be done, and then discuss some of the many issues that make such contributions so challenging. The US 538 Air Expeditionary Advisory Squadron mission in Afghanistan was to train, advise and assist the Afghan 373 Fixed Wing Squadron to conduct a full spectrum of joint air power solutions with assigned fixed wing aircraft in support of Afghan security objectives. Mouthful, of course. The Afghan 373 Fixed Wing Squadron mission was to conduct fixed wing flight operations in support of Afghan security forces, including distinguished visitor and humanitarian airlift, standard air mobility or airlift stuff. The US military commitment to this activity included 28 USAF or USAF and USN air advisors who worked with 150 Afghan airmen. In reality, this meant the US military operated a joint flying squadron that sought to provide education in the fundamentals of flying and how to operate a professional flying organisation. This went from squadron level up to wing and air force. The Afghanis had to combat not only graft and corruption, but also their atrophied flying skills and airmanship taught long ago under Russian occupation. The initial cadre of aircrew were experienced but not properly trained, and the fundamentals of a military flying unit were absent. A USAF mate of mine who commanded the squadron in 2013 stated, "We had to start at the basics of flying as well as squadron functions. We taught them how to set a schedule to rotate crews and aircraft for maximum efficiency and effectiveness for training, operations and maintenance." Maintenance was the kicker. They didn't understand that requirement. The Russian way was to fly the aircraft into the ground and then get more. Assessing the effectiveness of the mission against the broad aim of improving the security capability of the Afghan military makes for sombre reading. The tactical gains were good. Afghan Air Force air and maintenance crews made solid progress. Crews were eventually able to fly unescorted and conduct missions across the desired spectrum. Maintainers were able to apply the fundamentals of a squadron maintenance function, and the unit began to operate as a recognised flying unit. However, the strategic level is another story. The 6 C-27 and 6 AN-32 aircraft were difficult and expensive to sustain, and despite being suitable for the missions and the roles needed to support the Afghan military and police forces, they were not politically popular because they were considered diminutive and therefore lesser aircraft compared to C-130s, which the US government had supplied to Iraq. Those 12 aircraft have now been retired, and 373 Squadron is in the process of re-equipping with 4 ex-USAF C-130s, a more complex aircraft to fly and operate, and a very significant maintenance requirement. The issues that have affected the maturing of 373 Squadron, in particular logistics sustainment and political whim, are good examples of the challenges of an air perspective for the delivery of Indigenous security capability development. So what lessons can we draw from this example? I spoke earlier of the fundamental characteristics of air power, but there are also some fundamentals in the costs of owning and operating air power that are worth considering. The first is the outright dollar cost of pursuing any aviation capability, especially military aviation. Flying operations are inherently expensive. Aviation assets are expensive to acquire, and aviation operations are very expensive to set up. Running costs over the life of an aviation capability are similarly high, and they increase over time. Aviation operations also have long tails. They require significant support bases that are also expensive and require long-term investments in people, infrastructure and industry to support. Aviation operations are also fragile. Investments in people, their training, flying and operating skills atrophy quickly if not used often enough and if not refreshed regularly through training. Aviation capability is easily degraded below the critical mass needed to sustain an ongoing, safe, airworthy and mission-worthy state if not protected and supported adequately. Once that capability sinks below critical mass, disproportionate time, effort and money is generally required to rescue the capability. Aviation operations require long-term commitments and investments that are not always politically supportable. The expense of the operation, the necessary investment time, the fragility of aviation operations and the perceptions around effectiveness and reliability, especially by comparison with land and maritime security capability, can make aviation operations politically unsustainable. Moreover, most nation states will require some land-based security capability anyway. The air capability is often seen as an optional rather than essential security component, and the money required to sustain an aviation capability goes a long way when spent on additional troops and police and their equipment. Finally, it's worth noting that not all nations need an aviation arm as a part of their security apparatus, although I think there is strong argument to say that all could make good use of the aviation at the lower end of the security spectrum, if nothing else. Ultimately, the air perspective for the Indigenous security capability development starts with finding the right mix of air capability. Also worth considering is how the Royal Australian Air Force would resource an operation similar in scale to the Afghan mission I just described. An ongoing commitment to a deployment of 30 or so maintainers, aircrew and logisticians would probably be supportable, but there would also be a considerable support bill to accompany such a mission. For example, who and how would we ensure the safety of our people to operate on these aircraft in an uncertain airworthiness environment? What about flying safety management above the unit level? Or training resources and their overheads? What about the management of the logistics sustainment contracts on behalf of the partner nation? These things and many more would involve a much larger commitment than the 30 or so aircrew technicians and logistics staff. I don't mean to suggest that such an operation is beyond us, but it would come at considerable resource and opportunity cost. If we leave behind the high-end warfighting security development needed in Afghanistan and confine ourselves to our own region for a moment, then we can ponder the art of the possible at the lower end of the security spectrum. The high costs of operating and maintaining an air capability can be mitigated by carefully selecting air capabilities to suit the need of a nation. For example, the patrolling of fisheries and the conduct of anti-smuggling operations by South Pacific nations does not necessarily require large, sophisticated military aircraft like the P-3 Orion or the P-8 Poseidon. Small, single-engine commercial aircraft can produce worthy results at a fraction of the cost, and in some instances, the service can be leased rather than requiring the necessary upfront investment. Indeed, such an example was recently set up and administered by our own International Policy Division within the department. Other examples include the work by both the Australian Army and the Royal Australian Air Force in supporting the PNGDF with their air transport capability. For a period in the 1980s and 90s, the PNGDF operated both the Nomad fixed-wing and the Iroquois helicopter, aircraft also operated by both the Royal Australian Air Force and the Australian Army, while the PNGDF pilot training was conducted at No. 1 Flying Training School and their flying instructors were trained at the Central Flying Training School. While I admit that PNG is a country of greater means and better able to support and justify an aviation arm, more so than many others, the PNG efforts can be replicated elsewhere in our region and produce worthy security outcomes. So I'm going to close in a moment, but before I do, I want to reiterate some points or lessons that pertain to working with another nation to build an Indigenous aviation security capability. The first of those, working with partner nations to this end potentially offers those nations with a very significant improvement in their ability to provide for their own security needs. But the great advantages that are made available to users must be carefully weighed against the costs and resource implications of operating an air arm. Secondly, careful examination of the needs of a partner nation and tailoring the aviation solution is essential if that solution is to be effective and long-lasting. And finally, setting up an Indigenous aviation capability that is owned and operated indigenously is an expensive business that requires long-term investment in people and infrastructure, and this generally requires long-term political commitment, something not always easily achieved. For many nations though, perhaps for most, an aviation capability is an essential component of that nation's security apparatus. For large partner nations with long borders, or even small nations with millions of square kilometres of exclusive economic zone, where terrain makes road transport impossible, aviation is an obvious choice, and the RAF must be prepared to continue to work in, train, advise and assist missions in this regard. Thanks.
Your questions, comments, please. Commodore Jack McCaffrey.
Thank you. Matt, could you just expand on the statement you made towards the end about IP Division funding some kind of aerial surveillance program for the South Pacific, please?
I regret that I can't remember the nation involved, but I had the privilege last year of working inside the office of the CDF, where we were unfortunately dealing with what was fast becoming a legal matter of the company involved. But leaving that aside, IPDiv in the process of providing defence support to one of the South Pacific nations had provided a good deal of money and contracted a number of hours of essentially daytime patrolling on behalf of that nation. It was a pretty simple operation. They operated two light aircraft. I think they were both single engine, and they provided a number of hours of patrolling inside that EEZ for those very basic missions. And I think worthwhile, part of the point of what I was trying to bring out today is that there is a spectrum of train, advise, assist missions that we can get involved in, and at the lower end, at the perhaps less complex end, there are relatively simple solutions perhaps that the air perspective can bring for those nations. Solutions might be the wrong term. There are simple air activities that can make significant impact on the ability of that nation to provide its own security.
Thank you. Centre for Army Lessons.
Yeah, I know I'm a regular fixture now. Sir, thanks for your presentation, but we've been hearing a lot about land mentoring and capacity force building, and I guess having the air perspective this afternoon starts to make me think about going into the joint domain and how much mentoring, training, support, security force assistance we've been placing at that joint level. We've heard about the National Academy and so on. Do you have any perspectives on how much effort we have or should place on joint capacity building?
Well, look, I'll just start. I've only just recently become aware that there is a mission, and my Jock Air Commodore colleague here is nodding, that is, I think it's only recently come up whereby, and I'm pretty sure it's a joint mission, it's not an Air Force mission, working with the essentially the Afghan Air Force, but the Afghan government to provide them advice in this very role. I would have spoken about it in more detail, but unfortunately I didn't have those details available. But I think you're on the money, and really we can open up our eyes and work very much in that joint space. I spoke about it from an air perspective. I tended to talk to you from an Air Force perspective, but it really shouldn't be. It should be the medium that we're discussing here, not the the service that's providing that particular assistance. And I think you're on the money there. We should be looking. Yeah. But in the end, assisting those nations come to that conclusion too is. I'm sure they have that conclusion, but it is. I've described some of the issues that come with an aviation arm, and I think sometimes there's such an elevation in the complexity and if nothing else in the dollars that are involved, that it just becomes a bridge too far for many nations.
Thank you. Wayne.
Matt, a great presentation, and you came at it from a perspective that I sort of wasn't thinking about, so very informative and no surprises from your research. With the Train Advise Assist mission that's going on in Afghanistan at the moment, it's a rotary wing capability. It's been a bit of a hot potato between the services, and I welcome Noel's commentary on this. And it comes to one of the things we've been talking about is TAA, is Train Advise Assist, a main core role of the Army and the military, and how much effort and resources do we dedicate to it to ensure we can do it at short notice and to a high standard and safely. I ask an open question about the commitment of Air Force to come and get dirty on these Train Advise Assist missions, and your USAF colleague is my colleague as well from our CDSS class, and for the audience's notice, he wears a bracelet because 9 of his USAF colleagues were killed in an insider attack. It's dangerous. Is there the commitment for the Air Force to come on these missions?
Well, I'll start with our preparation to conduct such missions, and I would say to you that there is no deliberate activity specific within Air Force which is designed around preparing an Air Force Train Advise Assist activity in relation to a high-end warfighting style scenario that you're probably getting towards, and that's the Afghanistan mission. But at the same time, there are elements of Air Force that are well disposed to working with partner nations, predominantly within our neighbourhood, because we're doing this year in, year out. And I speak about Indonesia, especially Malaysia and some of the other Southeast Asian nations. So on the one hand, in a region, yep, I think we have good relationships and a good understanding. There's not a deliberate training or a development path for people to work in that space. But in terms of going to the Middle East or to South Asia to perform those roles, no. And look, I've only been here for part of the conference, but I mean, already there's a recurring theme about the fact that we're just not postured. Air Force isn't, and I'm getting the impression that the ADF is not really postured to do this in an ongoing way. It's one of those things we do because we can, rather than because it's a core part of our mission.
And just a final response.
It was a Cessna 172 that they were flying in the patrol mission, and one of the biggest challenges we had is getting the maritime response in support of an aircraft doing surveillance. And so it's a classic example of you can surveil and you can provide all the support to the nation under the sun, but if they don't have the response asset following that surveillance, it doesn't actually achieve the effect. I can't remember the exact country, but it's in the Southwest Pacific. I'll probably remember it over afternoon tea. Yeah. It's tied into the broader remit. In terms of is Air Force ready to get its hands dirty, if it involved JSF, I could be flippant and say yes. We are trying to work out how we advise in the TAC Air role in Afghanistan in the conduct and maintenance of operations as compared to the physical out there doing the training. One of the biggest challenges we face in the air environment is the method in which we train. So whilst you can do a significant amount of work in the BPC or the AA role where you're inside a training area stepping through the process, the very nature of the air activity, we do the actual training on operations. That's because it's cost effective. It is actually just not feasible to do the training inside a training area. The, I'll say, mortality rate for people who conduct operations when they're inexperienced and they do it in high altitude, high demand warlike operations is significant. And I would argue that neither the Army nor the Air Force nor the Navy or anyone in the ADF would be willing to really get out there and accept the risk that will be born of trying to do those operations. Now, it's one aspect in the helicopter role, which is the starting point, noting they're operating generally Russian-based aircraft which haven't been maintained very well, even as we move forward and they replace with newer, more complex systems. But the aircraft they bought in the ground attack role, Super Tucano, is a training aircraft that's been adapted to go out and do this job. That would involve us putting people in platforms that we would never acquire, that we have no skill sets in, to go and do a role for which we did not actually undertake. So the appetite, I'd suggest, for Air Force is relatively low, if not non-existent, in that space. Where we can provide and do provide the role is in the airlift role, the air mobility space. And once again, that becomes fairly benign. And the people you're training are people who are already qualified and competent. And so their need for training that we would actually be able to value add is relatively low. So for the return on investment and return on risk for the Australian government, it's just not worth that effort. Should we do more? Yes. If we can find an opportunity, is there the appetite? Probably not at the moment, but there should be.
We've stumbled across maybe a subject about which there are many perspectives, but again, to keep to our program, sadly, we'll need to finish at that point. We are now, though, going to a break, so there'll be a chance for the conversations to continue. I know there's some questions that people wanted to put, but before we break, could we please thank our speakers for